And we might as well get started. Thank you, Amreen. And we thought we would start with introductions. So Susan, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can do. So my name is Susan Fairley. I'm the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health's Chief Standards Officer. I've been in post for about a year, and I am based at EMBL EBI, which is the European Molecular Biology Laboratories European Bioinformatics Institute. It's based on the Wellcome Genome campus just outside Cambridge in the UK, next door to the Sanger Institute. And I don't know if Amreen, would you like to go next?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Emreen. I'm the operations coordinator based at OICR in Toronto, Canada. And if you ever have any issues or questions about this process, then I'll be happy to direct you to the right person.
Thank you, Amreen. And Angela, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself next.
Sure, thanks. I'm Angela Page. I'm Director of Strategy and Engagement at GA4GH, and I am based at the Broad Institute in Cambridge, US. And I'm sort of orchestrating the logistics of this process, while Susan is the content. That's sort of our two roles across the organization. So I manage operations and communications and all of that.
Okay, and if I wonder if we could possibly ask to go around the rest of the room and ask everybody else just to give a brief introduction to who you are and what your interests are. I wonder, Ariel, could I possibly start with you?
Oh, thank you. Yes, hello, I'm Ariel. Thank you for receiving us. We are from Indonesia, so greetings. It appears that this time the time is more inhumane for you guys, maybe. I appeared on the previous one, but it was really early and I wasn't fully awake. I actually brought one of my team member here, actually, Miss Alvania. I think she will introduce herself after this. So we are from GSI Lab is Genomics Solidaritas Indonesia. It basically means genomic solidarity for Indonesia. So actually we started as a pandemic response for the COVID-19 variants, but we want to continue to provide many other genomic-based testing. And the major ones that we are looking forward to leap into includes whole genome sequencing, cancer, and direct-to-consumer services. And we realized that in Indonesia, maybe Southeast Asia, there is very sparse information on how to do this responsibly and correctly. So we've been doing some research, and I think we had a very productive meeting with Susan already, with my CEO actually. And so we are very encouraged to join these discussions with GA4GH. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Is it okay if I ask my team member to introduce herself next?
Yeah, please do. I was going to suggest that it would be timely to go over to Alvania next. But if you could give us an introduction, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Alvania.
Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for this great opportunity. My name is Alvania, but you can call me Nia. I'm a junior member from Genomics Solidaritas Indonesia. I'm very looking forward for this discussion about the genomic data. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I wonder if Francisco, if I could ask you to introduce yourself next.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for this meeting. We are working in a bioinformatics department, a small bioinformatics department, and we have many interests related these topics in this meeting. This is my first time in this kind of meeting, and I had to confess something. I had a mistake because I understood the time hours in another order. So I only can stay the first part, but for the next time, I will pay attention with detail. Sorry.
It's not a problem. We appreciate you joining us for the time that you can give. Thank you, Francisco. And I wonder, Nikki, if I might ask you to introduce yourself next.
Hi, Camilla from University of Cape Town. I lead H3 Bionet, so we're part of the H3 Africa Driver Project. And so I'm joining to see what is what's new and just to catch up. See if there's anything useful I can say.
Thank you very much indeed. And Jonathan, if I could perhaps go to you.
Hi everyone, sorry I had to join slightly late. So I'm Jonathan Tedds, I'm based at the Elixir Hub, and we have a strategic partnership through Elixir with the Global Alliance, and in particular in my area around the compute platform and related technical areas, we play a strong role in the cloud work stream and the researcher identity work streams. So the passport standard, but also the cloud-based standards. And we're developing federated analytics solutions across our mostly European-based nodes and trying to look for examples and opportunities to implement those going forward.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. So first of all, thank you very much indeed all for joining us and giving us some of your time this morning. I think we have a few slides just to get us started and to set the scene for the discussion. But the hope today is that primarily we are in listening mode. One of the things that we're really hoping to do today is to get some feedback from yourselves. So as background to this, J4GH reviews basically what's going on every couple of years and are we meeting the needs of the genomics community. This year, however, rather than doing a kind of complete review of strategy, the intention is to revisit the outcomes from the last one of these reviews, which was 2 years ago, and basically see how we're doing on that. How are we progressing on those community imperatives that were identified from the last strategic refresh. So the last one of these was an exercise that was led by Heidi Ream, based at Broad, and Andrew Morris, based at HDR Health Data Research UK. And the three areas that they identified as ones for J4GH to focus on going forward from 2020 was interoperability and alignment between the standards, implementation support, supporting people who wanted to go ahead and implement the standards, and also in particular engagement with healthcare and clinical standards. So what we're hoping to do this year, and this is one part of it, this is one of a series of town hall meetings that we're having, there's also surveys that we're sending out and stuff as well, is identify opportunities where we can take forward those 2020 priorities. Also try to identify any kind of current successes and failures in our current processes and approaches, and also try and identify if there's any gaps, if there's things that we should be doing that we're not currently working on. So I guess if we could go to the next slide, please. So the outcomes, as I've said, from the gap analysis that was done 2 years ago by Andrew and Heidi, were that they identified that we were developing standards, but we weren't necessarily providing so much support for people who then wanted to go ahead and implement those standards and build their own implementations. The other one that was identified, as we've said, is interoperability and alignment. So that's kind of interoperability and alignment across the standards. And we've seen work taking that forward, I think in particular around about passports and some of the cloud standards. We've seen fairly significant work and people working on use cases and projects that put these standards together so that you can use multiple of the J4GH standards for some given use case. But there, we've also seen efforts, for example, I think VERSE and the PhenoPackets teams have worked at integrating those two standards. So VERSE is obviously our variation representation specification. PhenoPackets is describing phenotypes. They've done work to kind of integrate those standards, but there may be other areas that are obvious to you that are not obvious to us, where there's scope for us to be doing more work. And then finally, this last piece, engaging with healthcare and clinical standards. I think it's fair to say that some of the standards that have been in J4GH the longest really have some roots in genomics research, but that there is scope for us to build more on the clinical engagement. Obviously, genomics has been featuring in research for rather longer than it has been in clinical settings. So looking at how we go about engaging with that, and from that point of view, it's lovely to see groups represented here today who are very much involved in the healthcare and clinical end of the work. And if we could move to the next slide, please. So some of the things that have kind of come out of that analysis and influenced thinking from that and taken us through to now and looking to the future. How have we been addressing those imperatives? Well, one of the things that we've been doing is looking at how do we make it easier for people to adopt the standards. And one of the ideas that have supported that has been the development or the beginning of developing a thing that we call the starter kit. So the starter kit currently covers a handful of the standards, but these are basically fairly simple, fairly lightweight implementations of those standards. The idea being that they should be relatively easy for people to pick up and adapt and deploy in their own environments. And we've now managed to get some tests running, which are using a number of the different GA4GH standards running off of the starter kit implementations. So that's one strand of activity is the starter kit. Another is looking at working with the implementation community. And I mean, for me, it's interesting the way in which we're presenting this here, that we have these kind of separated out between both the GIF, the Health Implementation Forum and the driver projects, and FASP. And in some senses, I think to some extent, some of these are almost all one and the same. Because one of the things that we're hoping to do is to start and pull use cases from the Health Implementation Forum through into FASP. So FASP, for the uninitiated, is our Federated Analysis Systems project. So this was actually a group that started from the ground up, where people were saying, okay, we've done development work on these standards, but actually what we really want to do is we want to use them together. We want to be able to use passports to say that I am some given researcher who is able to access data using DIRS and who is then able to execute a workflow on that data using the workflow execution service. So looking at how these different standards could be pulled together and integrated. And then also, as I say, looking at making sure that we have the starter kit implementations there to support people as well. I'm moving to the next slide, please. So I suspect if you have found your way here, you have almost certainly been shown the Anna video at some point in time, which discusses the overall kind of GA4GH mission of supporting genomics and health. But the range of activities that we would imagine are necessary in supporting genomics and health are kind of captured on this slide. So it starts off with a data donor. So that might either be a patient in a clinic or a research study participant, going through the consent process, generation of data, the file formats that capture that data, also the records needed with that, then through to research ethics committees, data custodians. How do they manage data once it's been generated? How do they store data? How do they manage access to it, and data access committees? Then also, though, how do people discover that that data exists? How do they find it? What services might be available there? So how does a researcher access the data? How do they find it? How do they then run analyses on it? And then what about sharing the data and also return of results and sharing that analytical outputs? And that takes us all the way through background to return of results and thinking about what actually makes it back to the patient or research participant at the end of this process. This slide shows those different steps. The little GA4GH logos are also there to indicate different standards that have been developed at different stages in this cycle. And as you can see, we've got a reasonable number, but we also see that there are seemingly, I think, still gaps in what we have. So one recent initiative that kind of started last year is computable cohort representation. That was partly spurred on by COVID work and people realizing that being able to identify cohorts of patients is actually, it's very useful, and it's something that being able to do that in a standardized way so that you can work across different systems is actually incredibly useful. And that's almost certainly not the only gap that may exist. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So that brings us through, I suppose, really to what we're hoping to talk to you guys about today. There's kind of 4 different things that we were hoping to kind of structure this around. One is the first one of these, kind of as they were termed, community imperatives that came out of the last review in 2020, interoperability and alignment. We've then also got integration and engagement as the other 2, and then a kind of open air section where, it may not be related to these things, but if it's feedback that you would like to share with us, we would really appreciate hearing from you. As I say, the aim for us this year is to contact people to either via the survey or through meetings like this, and to provide an opportunity to discuss these different topics and to hear what your thoughts are in these things. And in many senses, if you're new to GA4GH or you have had limited contact with us, actually that makes your opinions really valuable and really useful to us as well. It's interesting for us as to hear also though from people who are very experienced with GA4GH, who have had spent a lot of time in the project. We know that people who have obviously spent a lot of time with the project will have, perhaps I want to say almost a deeper insight, and that's maybe not quite the right way of putting it, but you'll understand the intricacies of of how as an organization we operate and maybe able to offer additional insight. On the other hand, we really do need and want to engage with a broader range of groups around the world. So hearing from people who are maybe not so heavily embedded in the work as well is also incredibly valuable to us. So having said all of that, I think if we now maybe want to focus on this topic, which this slide is discussing, and kind of center the first part of our meeting on that. So as I say, one of the topics that we wanted to revisit was this idea of interoperability and alignment of the standards. And there's this idea of, what does success look like in this area? That we have truly interoperable standards that will enable solutions that can encompass multiple components of a pipeline and multiple platforms and use cases. So basically things just work and they just work together, and it doesn't matter what compute platform you're on or what pipeline it is that you want to run, it'll just happen. Some of the things that have been proposed to help address this is we have our technical alignment subcommittee called TASK. So that is a group of people. We have a representative from each of the different GA4GH work streams. They meet once a month. There's a GitHub repo and people have the option to create issues on there, which TASK can then follow up on and discuss or invite people in to present more information on. In terms of alignment between the standards, one thing that's a kind of recurring theme is the issue of data models. And if somebody has modeled a certain entity in some given way, being able to easily reuse that elsewhere so that you are then able to kind of cleanly map across standards or work across standards using that same entity. One of the things that had been put forward there some time ago was the idea of schema blocks, which was developed by Michael Bowdis. I think also Melanie Corto and Andy Yates may have had input in that. That has kind of evolved somewhat. So now we have instead the idea of a data model library for the GA4GH standards, which can house elements of data models from the standards. And then separate to that, there's also a new piece of work getting off the ground just now that is looking at how you might go about sharing data models and data structures more generally. So if you're sharing your own data, perhaps you want to use the Data Connect API, how might you describe how that data is structured? And then on top of that, we have where we have had the connection demos that have come from the Federated Analysis Systems project. So I think a couple of years back, they did one based off of 1,000 genomes data, where they were looking at running a short, simple workflow, but using kind of real tools across, I think it was about 5 different platforms, and with varying implementations. So, some from DNA Stack, some running on Terra, and some in Elixir and so on. So when we're thinking about what we're doing at the moment in terms of addressing this interoperability and alignment goal, these are kind of the main things. We've got the Federated Analysis Systems project, which is helping people pull together use cases that people can then work on as a group. We've got the technical alignment subcommittee to provide a forum where people can discuss alignment across work streams. And then we've also got various pieces of work looking at how we share data models. So I think that is all that I want to say on this one. And I guess basically this is the point. This for us is the exciting point. This is the bit where we would like to open the floor to you guys and see what your thoughts are. And Catherine, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's lovely to have you here. I wonder if I could be a real nuisance and maybe invite you to share your introduction that you've just typed in, but maybe do so, and that also gives everybody else the opportunity to start to gather their thoughts.
Hi, thank you, Susan. Sorry for joining a bit late. My name is Catherine Johnson, and I am a member of the H2 Africa project, which is a driver project in GA4GH. I work with Nicola Mulder, and I've had a very little bit of involvement with the ClinFino work stream and a fair amount of participation in the pedigree project there.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so thinking, I guess, a bit about interoperability and alignment, I suppose, first of all, does anybody have any initial comments? I suppose maybe related to that, I mean, I suppose also interesting to know, I suppose, first of all, were people aware of those initiatives? Were people aware of TASK and FASP? I know it's a horrible set of acronyms, but were those things that you'd heard of or had familiarity with before they were mentioned today? It's fine if people hadn't heard of them.
I mean, I don't want to skew the results, but like we haven't. But I mean, because we're such new. But I mean, yeah. Because like even I think the background is that in Indonesia, sequencing is only beginning, I think, last year. Like more clinicians are knowing about it. So these are all acronyms. However, as you explained it, we understand its usefulness, and like we know that that's exactly what we've been trying to look for, because there are different platforms and there are different use cases, and there's even different subject matter that somehow uses different formats. So now that we know that, it's much better.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I don't know, I'm going to be a little bit unkind. Jonathan, I wonder if I could pick on you, because I know that you're involved with Elixir, and I know that Elixir has had involvement in some of these things. I wonder if you have any comments or thoughts on what Elixir's experience of some of these groups has been.
Yeah. So we were one of the, as you were saying earlier, one of the demonstrators for the Federated Analysis Systems Project, FASP, as everyone calls it. And that involved basically utilizing, in our case, all 4 of the approved cloud workstream standards on across 5 different compute centers, or compute nodes, if you like, in Elixir across Europe. And there's been a lot of good collaboration in terms of those other platforms that have also demonstrated in a similar way. I think for us, the next priority, and you mentioned that we demonstrated this for a sort of simple 1,000 genomes public data set. We obviously think a lot in Elixir about, as I'm sure most of you on this call do, about the sensitive data requirements and governance around human data. So we're looking at how we can apply these use of these standards in an integrated way in platforms for key initiatives such as the sort of international cohort studies through, for example, the Chineke project, which sort of involves I think some others on this call as well. So there's a lot of work on how we can best implement these, and the idea being that through initiatives such as 1 million plus genomes, how can we you're never going to create templates as such in this respect, in this context, but how can you sort of demonstrate best practice in terms of use in order that the various international initiatives don't have to reinvent the wheel every time when implementing these kind of use cases. A priority for us in the current work after those demonstrators on federated analytics is how to integrate Passport specifically. So Passport is the sort of researcher identity work streams implementation around researcher identity. What we want to do is, you can obviously see the power if we can successfully integrate the two. I think we know we can do it technically. It's just a matter of agreeing a way that's sort of transferable across a range of initiatives. And obviously there's been implementations with DNA Stack and Terra. I think something we're thinking about now is how to identify the right use cases for these standards. In bioinformatics, more generally, there's this very large community around Galaxy, and that tends to be a slightly closed box in terms of how they do the compute inside that community. And we're having a lot of interesting discussions with them in terms of how can we align what they're doing using these cloud standards. And then the work we've done so far has resulted in a number of potential collaboration discussions with Nthought is one of the companies. There's a number of these companies that work on various knowledge graphs and various other aspects around research data sharing, and that the interface in genomics between the commercial sector and the public providers and so on. So we are looking at, I just gave one example there, but there's a number of them, a number of interested parties who are interested in co-developing around these standards as well. So it's kind of a big open space really as to where we go next, but I understand it's important for Global Alliance as well to be able to demonstrate so that and get buy-in, get take up and get people interested to see real use case examples of implementation of these standards.
That's really interesting, Jonathan. I was also so I guess one thing to share for everybody on the call. I think we're hoping to share the agenda for the upcoming Connect meeting, the April Connect meeting, based in, it's a hybrid meeting, but running in Montreal towards the end of April. I think it's 20th to 22nd is the dates. We're hoping to have a session there, which is going to focus based on FASP, the integration project, and which is going to be looking at passports and additional standards that it may be integrated with. I was also interested, though, you mentioned specifically about, obviously you're looking at human data, you're looking at security, partly based off, this terrible timing, because I see Nikki has just messaged to say that she has to step away for a minute or two. I had a very interesting conversation with Nikki and some of her team members last week about a use case that she had mentioned in a talk that she gave a couple of weeks back at ICDA, I think that's the right conference, interested in federated imputation. And I was struck that was one of the use cases which seemed to get into a number of issues relating to security, because you're using panels to do the imputation, which can't necessarily be passed around. At the same time, you can't also necessarily pass around the data that you may wish to impute against. So you have these two different data sets that you want to put together, and actually you have more data sets because the possibility is that you may wish to actually benefit from multiple data sets or multiple panels when doing imputation. And then there's additional issues around about how you might merge data back together. And we were talking on things like crypt for GH, passports and so on. I was curious, Jonathan, if are there currently use cases that you're seeing that look specifically at the security standards, or are you at a kind of earlier stage where you might be looking at kind of talking to others and trying to identify use cases of common interest?
Yeah, it is mostly earlier stage, and I think each different conversation we have with different providers has a different agenda and a different, they're interested in different stages of this. But yes, broadly, I would agree that that's what we're doing. I think, yeah, I mean, there are various, as I say, international cohort study-based projects that Nikki's involved in, for example, as well as other global partners that potentially could really use this. In terms of, when you look at the 1 million plus genomes initiative, it's an initiative. There aren't necessarily implementations yet, but it's something that will seek to support various for example, national level implementations, and having well documented, well described and standards-based implementations to draw upon should be very helpful for the various national partners who are sort of building up their infrastructure and looking at doing something along the lines of Genomics England and other examples. And Genomics England are part of that conversation too, in terms of the work they've obviously done on this, and they have a strong interest in those cloud and research identity, and we can probably learn a lot from them in terms of how to implement the appropriate security standards in these as well. I guess I'm also thinking about the sort of main themes of this section about what's working and what could be better, and I'm thinking that I think the thing, hopefully it's reasonably clear to people, even relatively new people, from what we've just been saying, that and I'm a firm believer, I've worked on and off on sort of important standards in different science domains actually over many years now. This foundational work on standards is really important. It does end up being applied and being useful. It's long-term work. You often don't see the fruits of it very quickly because most projects are engaged in implementation now. But they do benefit over time, and I've seen the real benefits of that in a number of areas. But I guess the thing so what could be better is we obviously need to start doing that. I think newcomers to Global Alliance, it's not clear to them how to get to, they can obviously see the current structures of Global Alliance around the work streams, around the standards processes. It's not often easy, especially for, I guess, more commercially focused groups to understand what else that Global Alliance is doing. In other words, how do you get from these standards to implementations? And I know that there's a whole focus on demonstrating that, demonstrating implementations going forward. But I guess there may need to be something we do at the organizational level in terms of making it more obvious to newcomers how you get involved, how can you find out about how these standards have or might be applied in different use cases. It's not necessarily an easy one to fix, but I think that's a sort of a clear area where we could improve and drive engagement as well.
No, that's really interesting.
Sorry.
Just go ahead, Angela.
Quickly, sorry, just to jump in. I'm realizing as I'm taking notes on here that we're writing down what's working and what's not working. I think another thing I'd really like to write down is like ideas that you have and suggestions for improving what's not working. So if anybody on this call has ideas to respond to that, I'd love to hear them.
Okay. And also, I guess I had another follow-up question. I was curious if you had, and it's maybe difficult to discuss, but I was curious if you had any specific examples of groups whom you've maybe seen showing some interest, but maybe we haven't done a good enough job of communicating to them, and you've maybe seen them show some initial interest and then step back, and it's maybe one to have a think about. But we'd be interested if you had any examples so that we could then kind of try and understand that one better.
Yeah, I'll be just very quickly. We need to have a follow-up, Susan. Apologies, it's been delayed by we're all involved in so many
life
things.
I think is the short answer, but
there is, so through Elixir we have sort of a relatively open, there are sort of more open and more closed forums within that network, if you like, and we have relatively open bi-weekly meetings around some of the work we're doing on the cloud standards, and it does involve, there are people from Sapporo, there are people from various groups globally who sometimes participate when we're talking about a particular area, and they sort of drift in and out of consciousness, if you like, at the Global Alliance level as well. So I do think there's a useful conversation we could have, and I'd get, you know, Alex Canitz and others who sometimes, some of the Elixir nodes in this case will have their own conversations with these commercial groups, and it might be that it never surfaces at the Global Alliance level as it, but actually it probably is useful that we sort of gather a few of those, because I don't think there's any reason why people wouldn't mind that, and it would be a way of us crystallizing some of the issues we've just been discussing on this call.
That sounds like it would be really valuable. So I guess if we can also make a note of it as an action, then that we should follow up with you on that one. I'd be interested also in going to Nikki, if she's back with us in a moment, about some of the potential security use cases. But I have apologies to Regan and Mutia for putting you on the spot. But at the beginning of the session, we did a kind of round table just to do a quick introduction of everybody. Regan, I know because Regan is part of the staff team. Mutia, I'm J4GH's Chief Standards Officer. I'm based at Embley BI in the UK, and I'm chairing today's call, in which we're hoping to hear from a range of people about their thoughts and views on Global Alliance in respect to how we're doing against some of the ideas around about interoperability, implementation, and engagement with the clinical community. Regan and Mutia, I wonder if I might ask the two of you to just briefly introduce yourselves to the group.
Sure, Susan. Yeah, thank you. My name is Regan Thomas. So I'm based in Hinton, UK. So I work as the workstream manager for cloud, GKS, and large-scale genomics. So yeah, that's it about me. Thank you.
Thanks, Regan. And Mutia.
Hi. Yes. Sorry. I'm on the road in the call. I hope my connection is stable enough. So I'm actually joining my colleague Ariel here. We're from GSI from Indonesia. We met last week with some of you, trying to connect to your institution and see how we can learn from you and maybe collaborate in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Mutia. And Nikki, I'm not sure if you're back with us at the moment. So I don't know, Catherine, could I be truly horrible and put you on the spot in Nikki's absence? Because I think when I spoke to Nikki last week, she was telling me a little bit about a kind of federated imputation use case, which I still owe an email on by way of follow-up. But during that conversation, I was talking to I think colleagues of yours, Mamana and Aitan, regarding that work, and they were talking a little bit about some of the standards that they saw integration of being useful, or using them together being useful. I wondered if you had anything that you might like to add on that.
Hi, Susan. I don't want to speak for Nikki because I haven't been very involved in the federated cohorts that she has raised them in meetings, and I've heard a couple of times mention about the GA4GH passport. So I know that it's something that she's really interested in and looking into. But I can't speak to the federated cohorts that were mentioned. I do want to just.
Please.
Sorry.
I was about to invite you to talk if you had anything else that you would like to share.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So I just thought I just agree with that comment about newcomers coming into GA4GH, and I don't think it's maybe just not necessarily newcomers, but even as a member of one of the driver projects, I think if you have not been a heavily active member in any of the projects or work streams, that maybe we need to do a bit more to kind of share what has happened with driver projects in various standards building, because I think that comment about it being unclear how newcomers can become involved or start to implement standards is very valid. I think when we go onto the GA4GH website, it's geared towards inviting people to become involved in the GA4GH community, but not necessarily to people who want to actually start to absorb and implement those standards. So the entrance to what has been developed over the last few years, I think, needs to be made clearer.
Okay. That's really interesting hearing you say that, Catherine. Also, it's worth mentioning we are actually working on a redesign of the website just now. I'm not sure exactly who we currently have in the group of people that we're consulting on that. I know that we've done surveys and such like in various stages to help guide that process. But I suspect that if you were willing to allow us to contact you, we might be grateful to have you as somebody that we could come back to.
Yeah, sure.
As we get the length of starting to test things out, I think we've made some reasonable progress there. We for sure know that there's scope for us to improve on the existing website, though. But that's a point well taken. So thank you very much for raising it.
Sure, I'm happy to help.
Okay, so I guess any more comments from anybody on this section? I'm going to try again to see if Nikki is back. Okay, in that case, I'm simply going to have to send my email.
I am here.
Oh,
I'm just that I'm sort of half in a meeting with a student at the same time, so I'm half listening.
That's no problem.
So you wanted to have input on the sort of the FASP, is that what you were saying?
Yeah, it's kind of interoperability and alignment to standards, using them together. And I guess I was partly thinking when Jonathan was talking about passports and integration, it was reminding me a little of the conversation that we had last week and thinking about the use of multiple standards in some use cases and also in particular some of the security ones.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a few use cases where we have, like our catalog where we have people can search for data and then they want to they request access via a DAC, and then then they get authorized, and that authorization immediately goes onto EGA. We have in our African genome variation database, we want to have sort of authentication for people who need registered access, and then additional authorization for people who need controlled access to that data. So we have been talking to the groups about that. The other use case, which actually I haven't discussed with you, it's not a use case of sort of the whole, kind of the use case of the whole thing, is one of the challenges we've had, and I've spoken to, I think I mentioned this actually to Peter, I think, I can't remember who I spoke to what about, is one of our challenges, and this is more a cloud issue, is, or maybe I did talk to you about it, is the fact that a lot of sort of implementations of so one of the end-to-end cases is we're going to be using Terra as a platform. So that uses TERS, DERS, WES, it uses quite a lot of the standards, and then so you find your data, you find your tools, and you execute on a cloud. But they're so tied to the clouds. So Terra can only work with GCP. Gen 3 can only work with AWS, even though they're all using GA4GH standards. So you'd think that the GA4GH standards would be the part that should make them cloud agnostic. But we have this challenge in that you need a separate implementation if you're using AWS. And it's not just a simple implementation. It's like massive amount of development work. We can't get Gen 3 to work on GCP. We can't get Terra to work on AWS or an on-premise solution. So somehow the standards are helping with an implementation, but that endpoint of how it's implemented, it's a cloud thing. I think it's the way the clouds are configured rather than a GA4GH thing. So I just don't know if there's something GA4GH is able to do, but I think we had the discussion we had was that there's this lack of willing because of the competition between the clouds, obviously. So I'm not sure what's something GA4GH can solve or not.
But it's
probably not.
Yeah, but it's an interesting question, and I think it's one that, in slightly different guises, we're seeing in different places. I know, for example, EBI, where I'm based, is working, I think, with both AWS and Google, and I can't believe that researchers at EBI are going to be overly thrilled at having to reconfigure things and discover that things won't work across platforms. And that's just one kind of drop in the ocean. I think we see a need for interoperability across cloud platforms, irrespective of what base infrastructure they're built on. And I think we also see that in things like NIH's cloud interoperability initiative. So I think that's a good point, and I'm not sure if it's one that we had actually captured during the course of this exercise so far. So I wonder just if anybody has
I mean, it's
no, please go ahead.
Sorry, so apparently one of the commercial companies is sort of thinking about solving this, but it's just, I think you are going to find more and more cases where there's some people who've got data sitting on an AWS bucket, some people have got data sitting on a GCP bucket because that's just who they work with, and that interoperability is just not there. You have to shift the whole data set, or you have to shift the tools, or so as I said, there's this not a lot of willing on the cloud providers to do this because they're obviously in competition with each other. But if it could be solved from the GA4GH perspective, I think that would be to make our lives easier. Anyway, I'll let you move on to the next thing.
That sounds true. Oh, thank you very much indeed. Although also happy to hear more comments. Okay, so I guess if we do then maybe move on to the next topic. So the next area that we've been looking at. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is definitely something that we really need to get to know more, because we are also starting to need, like, we want to make sure that whatever start fundamentals that we do, I guess the advantage that we have right now in GSI Lab is that we are really starting from the ground up. So we really want to make sure that we do it right. So I think this leads to that the red post-it, where as a new member, we don't know how to ask for, let's say, a demo, because we saw the website and there are ways to connect, and then we saw that there are API qualifications and the different pathways to do it. But it would be great if we can maybe ask for some time to consult and see how it applies, because right now we are also starting to decide which infrastructure that we're going to use, and most likely it's going to be AWS actually, and hearing up the problems just now. So I think this is something that maybe we can discuss more. Yeah, thank you.
No, sure thing. Okay, that's great. Okay, so moving to the next slide and starting to think a bit about implementation support. So this was the second of the three imperatives that Andrew and Heidi identified a couple of years ago. And in this instance, what they've said is that success would look like a scenario where we have driver projects and the expanding community are able to quickly adopt and implement GA4GH standards, driving broad uptake and subsequent interoperability across the community. And I guess to some extent, perhaps some of what Jonathan said earlier maybe relates to this. Some of the things that we're currently doing at the moment is, when a standard is proposed, we have 2 reference implementations or a requirement for it going through the approval process to demonstrate interoperability. And one of the ideas is that these reference implementations are also essentially kind of like living documentation. It's a chance for somebody to see, they should be open and people should be able to look at this and understand how the implementation works from looking at those existing reference implementations. We also have tooling to support documentation. We have the GA4GH Planet API. There are also, again, the connection demos from FASP. There's some online resources and some in-person training seminars, and also kind of live and recorded webinars. But be really interested, and I think it is interesting that we have a mix here of some people who I think are perhaps just starting to look at GA4GH standards, and others who've clearly been embedded in driver projects and others for a long period of time. I'm going to open the floor in just a moment to ask if anybody has any comments they'd like to share. I see though that we have been joined by, I think, Aka. Just at the beginning of the session, we did roundtable to introduce ourselves. I'm Susan Fairley. I'm the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health's Chief Standards Officer. I'm based at Embley BI in the UK. And we're doing this series of town hall meetings to try and get some feedback from a range of people on how we're doing on our strategic priorities. I wonder if I might ask you to introduce yourself.
Right. Hello, my name is Ucha. I'm from Indonesia, from a company called GSI Lab. Joining me are Dr. Ariel and Alfania. I am one of their staff members who are very eager to learn about yes, what you are doing here in GA4GH.
We're bringing a village here. Sorry.
No, it's absolutely brilliant. We're delighted to have so many people join the call. That's really great. Thank you for joining us, Ucha, and apologies for my mispronunciation of your name to start off with there.
Oh, no worries. Thank you for having us.
Right, thank you. So I wonder, does anybody have any initial thoughts on how we're doing in terms of implementation support?
I think the reading material is very comprehensive. It's really helpful to get to know GA4GH and being able to separate it into the three streams, right? You had, I mean, at least for the main one, I think it was ethics and then technicals and security, right? Something like that. Basically, that's how we understood it, and it was really easy for us to appoint, basically, like appoint which group should learn which part of the standards. So yeah, I think that's just from us. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Does anybody else want to jump in? Okay, Catherine, if I could be really horribly unkind and maybe come to you. You're obviously in one of our driver projects. We know that our driver projects tend to end up adopting the standards. I was curious if you had any thoughts or perspectives that you'd like to share from your driver project on what the experience you found of implementing the standards has been, and either thoughts on what you liked or where there's room for us to do more.
Thanks. I think in terms of adopting the standards and the tools that have been created so far, that a lot of the adoption is being driven by our H3 Bionet project, which is part of the H3 Africa driver project. A number of our H3 Africa projects within that consortium are either kind of ethics or clinical research. And I think that whilst the H3 Bionet network, which has a number of people with a lot of technical skills, is doing well, contributing both in GA4GH and identifying where these tools and standards can be used, that either those of us who are involved with GA4GH need to do maybe a better job passing on what has been developed to those projects who maybe don't have people directly involved with GA4GH, or we need to make sorry about the noise in the background. Maybe we need to, maybe we could do with some guidance on taking back to projects who are not staying connected with what's happening in GA4GH. How do we take those standards and tools and share about them to the projects that could potentially use them, but maybe are at a really kind of beginner level on how they could make the most of them and adopt them, and what it would mean for them going forward for future projects. I don't know. I'm sure Nikki will also have something to say to that.
Maybe that's a great cue to invite Nikki to talk.
Yeah, so Catherine is right. So H3 Bionet, we've had a lot of people who are really interested in the GA4GH standards. Some of them apply to us, some of them don't. So some of the GA4GH standards are more on the clinical implementation side, and a lot of the H3 Africa projects are academics, they're research projects. So it's research collected clinical data. versus healthcare collected clinical data. So that's why so the feeder packets, for example, we haven't used yet because it's quite specific to an individual, and whereas we're looking at sort of research cohorts. It's been difficult to get the H3 Africa projects interested in the driver project kind of connection, because they are clinicians and they're researchers and they don't understand data and they don't even know probably what an API is, let alone what it does. So so a lot of the work we've done with G4GH has been specifically through H3 BioNet, and we found, because we deal with the data, we found loads of really useful tools and standards, but trying to get clinicians and researchers to understand why these are important is difficult. And so it's almost like we need to show them some use cases, sort of let them see a real implementation where this worked without being too techy in that discussion. So I don't know, yeah.
I'm interested to hear you say that, actually, because this morning I had the good fortune to listen to a presentation being given by Decipher, who are obviously part of the Matchmaker Exchange program, and have very kind of real world use cases for some of this. But yes, you're right. I don't know that we present those perhaps terribly often. Ariel, please.
Yeah, I just want to echo that wording, because our collaborators are right now about 70% clinicians and like 30% scientists. And even the scientists are not really familiar with how, not how complex, but how useful it is if we understand the basics of the data first. Like whether they can be used in different pipelines, whether they can change to FASTA or FASTQ or different kinds of analysis after. It's actually really difficult to discuss that and make them see the, how to say, like the endpoint. Most of them during our discussions have always been like, how does this, the most basics one is always, how does this change our clinical reasoning, or how does this change our patient's outcome? And it's even then, if we go down to the scientist level, their basic questions will be, how does this make our the real basics? How does this make our paper release faster? It's really, yeah. Those are the kinds of meetings that we faced, and until now, we're lucky. Our team here, Dr. Ucha, Dr. Mutia, and Nia, and we have another several members. We have been able to basically fill in the gaps where we are the one that shows them in very simple matters, like basically with genetics, if you can diagnose better, then you can treat better, and if you can diagnose better, you can also decide on your patient's outcome faster, and faster means the government's happy with you. And it really comes down to those kind of terminology over here. But as the basically as we do the analysis, we also realize that these kind of database implementation is very important. Like data science is very important because it actually makes it faster in the long run, and we have experienced that with COVID. So that's why we are, yeah. But I just really want to echo that, because that really captured my sympathies. Like, oh, I'm so sorry that you have to go through that too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's really useful to hear. Thank you. I don't know, Nikki, did you have anything else that you wanted to say in relation to implementation? Okay, and Jonathan, I don't know, I know Elixir is obviously heavily involved in implementation, across many nodes and many different projects. I'd be interested if you had any thoughts that you wanted to share on this one.
Yeah, implementation. So I'm thinking aloud. I don't know what we can do in terms of Global Alliance successfully coordinates experts in particular standard areas. And I'm trying to think, is there a way we can provide a connection point for expertise to people implementing? Obviously there's going to be there's yourself and the people who are engaged already, I think, and potentially one or two more who can support projects, and somehow it's fitting in that's obviously quite direct support, but obviously limited. There's only so much of that Global Alliance could do specifically. And then there's how to connect to this broader set of experts working on problems in their institutes and organizations. And I guess I'm thinking that some way of that sort of networking, and it's you sort of need to advertise that through here's example implementations. But that seems to me to be one of the most useful and important things that you can do. What often happens is that projects, academic or otherwise, deploy experts, and maybe can resource technical experts to set up an environment and support an environment. But you have this real problem once that period of funding has completed in sustaining that expertise, and then where do you go, or how do you continue to maintain the work that was done previously? Part of the answer is using Global Alliance standards, right? You've got a set standards framework that people can work to, and ideally example implementations as well. But I do think that a kind of expertise connection point could be critical.
Okay, that's really interesting to hear, because I mean, I think at a very basic level, most of the time that I see implementers, it happens to be the people who are involved probably in driver projects, but who are involved in the standards development discussions and who are quite closely tied into the work. And often one of the things that we hear is that engineering time is a limiting factor for people if they want to go ahead and adopt the standard. Oh, it's great, we would love to make our project compliant with the standards, but that will take time, and we don't have time. And so I think we've been thinking in terms of things like the starter kit, and even things like the assigned experts program, which would enable people to have somebody funded to both contribute to the standards development work and implementation. But I think what I feel I'm hearing from you is that actually access to the expertise and being able to have dialogue potentially with people when you're thinking about implementing the standards would be really useful. And also, I suppose, kind of coming back to the previous point, in the first case, explain to people why the standards are useful, and in particular the potential benefits and kind of long-term maintenance and interoperability across different projects and different data sets. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yeah, I think often people who've wanted to talk to us are already doing their own implementation in some form or other, but they often would like to avoid reinventing the wheel. They're very keen to see what others have done, so they're not necessarily needing specific resource in their own use cases, but basically connecting to other experts who've worked on similar problems and sharing that knowledge. And it can work both ways. Obviously, sometimes these organizations have done something really useful already, which our academic partners, for example, could benefit from. So there's a few aspects to this.
Yeah, I'm also interested in the point you're making about kind of reinventing the wheel, because I'm curious as to, in approximate terms, how reusable you have found existing implementations to be. And I guess I'm also asking this a little bit with at the back of my mind, our starter kit implementations, because clearly there's, if there are some existing implementations that are already highly reusable, there's maybe less need for us to be developing a starter kit for those specific standards if there's something that's already easy to pick up.
Yeah, I don't have much specific experience yet of how well how good a job, if you like, or I would need to talk to people who've tried out the starter kit in their context to sort of understand that aspect better. But I do think it's important that we try to do so through the starter kit.
Okay. And I mean, I think we spoke a little bit about some of the different ways that we were, or that hopefully implementation is being supported through documentation and so on. I guess any comments on how successful or otherwise those existing attempts are? I think, Ariel, you mentioned at the beginning of this section that you'd found the documentation to be helpful. I feel Jonathan and others have said that in some instances at least, having additional access to expertise is somewhat useful. I guess just any other comments that anybody might want to share on
Is
this?
there like, I don't know whether it's a list or something, like, but like several days ago, we were discussing with some clinicians, and we came about the clean gen, one of the rare disease pathway making form. Nia, could you remind me what was the name that we used? I forgot the name of the name of, yes, CleanGen. Yes, that's the one. Yes. And so when I was looking through CleanGen and looking through the about and everything, I saw GA4GH logo there. Like, so that's how I know that, oh, so there is a network that is, I don't know whether it's supported or I don't know what's the right word, but like it's like they applies GA4GH beliefs, I guess, so far. That's how we can use it. So is there like a list on different parts? I also found the ontogeny something, human ontogeny or something that also has the GA4GH logo over there. So that's how we know. But I mean, it would be really helpful for us to see the models of how GA4GH is helping these kinds of workflows, I guess.
So I guess what we're maybe thinking about here is this sounds a little bit like the idea of a list of implementers and the ways in which
implementers
they're using the standards. I'm happy to tell you this is something that we already think is a really great idea and that we're working on getting in place. But no, that's again a really useful piece of feedback. So thank you very much. Okay, any final comment?
Just a little bit more if possible. I'm so sorry, but yeah, we are also like very interested in like the, you have those list of members and countries. Like, I wonder if, I don't know whether it's part of your ideology or something, but do their work like state that they're using J4J standard? Like, do they do that? Because we try, like for example, we find universities or in the different countries, and apparently nothing in Indonesia yet, so we're delightful in that. And like, is it part of your discussion with them that please put in standards by J4J or something like that? I don't know.
No, that's a really interesting point. I'm not sure that it actually is something that I don't think we make any requirement of anybody who's adopting or using the standards to advertise that they're doing such, but it's an interesting point. And we do see some groups who list where they're using the standards. A really nice example is Catherine North, who happens, of course, to be on our executive committee. So perhaps a conflict of interest there, but who will present on, say, Australian genomics work and illustrate the different points in their setup where they're using J4GH standards. But no, it's an interesting point. Okay, so I think at this point, I'm going to suggest, if nobody else has anything pressing that they want to share, that we move on to the third of our imperatives, which was engaging with healthcare and clinical standards. And again, when Andrew and Heidi did their work a couple of years ago, they came to this conclusion that success would look like the ability to efficiently and effectively respond to the needs of clinical stakeholders, developing standards that support the healthcare industry. So basically making sure that we're delivering what healthcare needs and that we're doing so in a timely fashion that's going to help the healthcare industry. Now, the current things that are being done that are in place to try and support this, there's the Genomics and Health Implementation Forum, which we typically end up referring to as GIF. That brings together, in particular, a large number of the kind of large national initiatives. So I am, for example, the likes of Australian Genomics, Genomics England, but many other groups as well. In addition to that, we've also got involvement with other standards development organizations. So that may be things like HL7, who of course produce also FHIR, who are involved in the world of electronic health records. It's also ISO, and we know that ISO certification is required for some standards to be adopted in healthcare systems. So we've just seen phenopackets, thanks to a lot of work by Lindsay Smith, one of our workstream coordinate managers. We've seen phenopackets go through ISO certification just recently, but also many other standards groups. And I was presenting the Genomics Standards Consortium last week, and there's many others. And then in addition to that, we also have this idea of developing a clinical advisory group, which I think is perhaps still a kind of idea rather than something that we have kind of moved forward with. So as I say, at the moment, we're really looking at GIF as probably being the primary forum that we have within GA4GH for interaction with, or more of a focus on health. And some level of cross-standards organization interaction, particularly in the area around kind of electronic health records. But I wondered if anybody would like to start us off with, if anybody has any initial thoughts about what we're currently doing here in terms of engagement with healthcare and clinical standards, or thoughts about things that we could or should be doing to improve our work in this area. I'm happy to hear any comments from anybody. Okay, in that case, I wonder, Ariel, if I might come to you. I'm interested to talk to you at this point, because obviously, as we've said previously, you guys are involved. I think you said you thought maybe around 70% of your work was more in the kind of clinical and healthcare side of things. Obviously, you're also new to GA4GH, so perhaps the ideal person to ask about how we're doing in terms of clinical engagement. I'm curious what you found the experience like of discovering GA4GH, and where you think there's scope for us to do better, or things that you found useful.
Right. I think the reason why that is because actually some of our backgrounds here are actually medical doctors, and then we went through several trainings for molecular biology, and that's why a lot of people in science basically sees how a lot of potential genomics is, and that's why we ended up here. But we often bridge clinicians and basically genomics-based research. And the one thing that we found really useful is the ethical guidelines, because the ethical guidelines was very clear on how to do this responsibly. A lot of clinicians, they know how useful it can be, but some of them are apprehensive on how to do it responsibly and correctly, especially in, I'm not sure whether I can say in Southeast Asia or just in Indonesia, but especially I think in the region, I actually do not see any like an overarching privacy law, like an overarching privacy law, like GDPR, I think, yeah, in Europe or something like that. That is not something that we find readily available for the region or for the country in general. Then the next one about you also have the section on data security, right? We find that also very useful, because then we know whether following the rules and regulations in our country is enough or not. Fortunately or unfortunately, Indonesia, the laws are very clear that no data can be sent or how to say processed outside of the country. That's why actually AWS and some other cloud services are really trying to establish a server in Indonesia, so for them to comply to that. So that's how we been able to persuade our clinicians to walk further into connecting genomics with clinical research, uh, because there's a lot of hypothesis and there's a lot of research topics, but they are apprehensive in moving forward because of that unclear ethical framework, at least from our side so far, and the laws and regulation that should apply to it. And that's how it was very useful for us to go through GA4GH. On the other hand, I think I'm not sure whether this is in our scope or not. We kind of, maybe it's not, come to think of it, but we kind of hope that we can really show the link that making this database or not data, I keep saying database, but I don't mean that. I mean like the data standards and the interoperability that we were talking about. It would make it easier for applications of public health genomics. For example, ways that we can uh, uh, translate research results to national health insurance policies, for example, or how it can correlate with, for example, patients' catastrophic costs. And I think part of your J4GH is also the integration with the FHIR, right? FHIR, right?
Mhm.
So that's also something that we realize is very important. I think that's, I mean, there are more, but I think this is the overarching problem and solutions that I think
That's
we can
that's
provide
interesting
in
to
J4GH.
hear. And I think some of what you're saying there is also you're kind of reminding me a little bit of conversations that we've had recently with people involved in the rare disease space, where there's very much a kind of research element, but also a clinical element. And often these things will be tied into, you know, that perhaps some given individual will have seen many different healthcare providers. The data may have come from one place, analysis may be being done somewhere else, but then there's also the business of kind of linking back to insurance and ongoing care for the individuals. So you know that's really interesting to hear, and I think that's a great point about the need to basically take this back to healthcare and think about how it sits there.
Yeah,
I
because
wonder.
like roughly, I'm sorry, but like just
Okay.
to reiterate again, like roughly every time we talk to a healthcare professional, meaning doctors, yeah,
Mhm.
in this context, they always come back to the same question, like how does, because from their mind, implementing these interoperability necessities require more work. But
Yeah.
that's from their mind, you know. But we want that to change. Like we want
Mhm.
to show them that this is not more work. This is just smoother work for faster future. That's what we hope. But I don't know. Yeah, thank you.
No, well, I think anybody who's ever worked on kind of interoperability of data and making sure that it's consistent to aid these things, we'd agree with that. I guess any comments from anybody else on this one in terms of how we're doing with engaging healthcare? Don't know, Nikki, I wonder if you have any comments. I know you mentioned that H2 Bionet is you know kind of primarily research focused, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on what the people from a kind of clinical background within that program, how they reacted to GA4GH, or anything that we could be doing to support them more.
Yeah, I mean, some of the projects are run by clinicians, and the kind of things, the kind of tools that they've been adopting or have been most useful have been things like the pedigree, because they, you know, for those that have to take family history. The rare diseases group is quite interested, I think, in the beacons, because they want to, you know, think about what they're very, and I think, you know, that the beacons that have clinical information as well as frequency information, I think will be of relevance to them. But as I said previously, you know, the clinical translational clinical side of things is much less a focus of the H Africa projects, because they're not working directly in healthcare. That, you know, they might be working as clinicians and translating a little bit on a very small scale to their own patients, but the kind of work that you're doing hasn't really applied to them. I think it will come in later when there is a closer tie to the clinical side, and maybe with the probably not with the DSR book actually. So I think there's been less not relevance, but less application from our side, because the clinicians are a bit further away from what you present, from what you are offering.
I mean, I'm curious also, in terms of one of the topics that we've touched on a little bit here is the need to explain perhaps the benefits of standardization in some settings to sometimes clinicians, sometimes to researchers. I mean, is there an argument for us, for example, attending some more clinically focused conferences and looking to present or engage there? And is it possible that, are there additional forums where we should be looking to engage with this community?
Yeah, so the clinicians that I know would go to very specific conferences, like cardio conferences or heart disease conferences or diabetes conferences. I'm not sure that you can really reach everybody. It's a lot of different conferences to go to. It's not like ICB where all of our physicians go. So it might be difficult to do that. I don't really know how to, what the best way to engage them is, because they all just have such different areas of focus.
That's completely fair.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's more the genetics conferences, because your genetics-based clinicians, your clinical geneticists are more likely to attend those. But your pure clinicians who may use some of these tools, that I think the meetings they go to are just far too diverse to be practical. But certainly, clinical geneticists, all the major ASHG, African Society of Human Genetics as well, that's happening in Morocco at the end of this year. I think that those are the guys who you would get their attention reasonably easily if you come in as a use case rather than as a technical talk again.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. Anybody else got any comments to add to this one? Catherine, I wonder if you have anything that you might like to add.
Thanks, Susan. I've been trying to think it over. I think that Ariel was right in pinpointing that the kind of entry point that I can see for the people that we work with, and as Nikki was saying, they're mostly clinical researchers and they're not engaging in kind of public health care so much. But the kind of entry point is those ethics, the ethics toolkit that's available. It's very digestible and really relevant for those working in the clinical research field. So I think that's a great place to start with the people that we work with, because it's directly impactful for them and relevant. And then just in terms of kind of how we can engage in the healthcare, because we're working with people in a number of African countries, what is challenging is that many of the countries have different kind of healthcare systems in place. So their electronic record systems are quite diverse and different. Mm-hmm. And the researchers haven't really, to the kind of knowledge that I have and exposure to them, there hasn't been this kind of transfer back of information and knowledge from the researchers who may be gathering more medical information and data on patients that would be helpful to their medical care, that kind of transfer back into a medical healthcare system, I don't think is happening. So it would be interesting to engage on that level researchers, because I think it would add a new dimension to what they're doing, because often there's a lot of focus on just gathering what they need to kind of tackle their protocol goals and their papers, but this idea of the longevity of the data that they're generating, besides being able to be reused, the other side is how can it be repurposed for healthcare, for their research participants, is really important. And then that interoperability with systems comes in. So I don't think we're quite there in terms of being able to implement it at the moment, but it's definitely something to start highlighting, particularly for the researchers that we work with in Africa, in terms of how can you contribute back to the well-being of your research participants.
That's really interesting to hear that. I was also struck by your comments, Catherine, about the diverse range of, for example, electronic healthcare records and things that you see.
No, go carry on. Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, I was just going to say I was listening to a discussion the other week about the situation simply within the UK, which is a kind of the National Health Service. And I know that there's diversity within different regions there, and that is, as I say, that's within one system in a comparatively tiny part of the world. Interesting to imagine what you're describing.
Yeah, I think that is one thing that is a little bit different from many of the countries that work in GA4GH, especially. There are multiple systems even within single countries, but in the African continent we have all these different countries, different government systems, and the different systems to grapple with. So yeah, there are a lot of challenges for sharing data and thinking about the systems that they're implementing and using.
No, that's really interesting, and it's in many senses a very deeply unfair question to put to the group. But again, one of the things when I think about, for example, the work going on, perhaps in particular in our clinical and phenotypic work stream, which is the end of the GA4GH standards that's most likely to have to interact with this diverse range of health settings. For me, I know that I would feel massively reassured if I felt that we were seeing good representation from different parts of the world to make sure that the standards are going to be fit for purpose and usable in this wide range of settings. So again, as you say, it is a challenge, but really interested if anybody at any point, either on the call today or sometime in the future, has ideas on how we can better engage and make ourselves more accessible to different groups in different parts of the world. Jonathan, I don't think we've heard from you on this one. I wonder if you have any thoughts that you might like to share. Jonathan, I'm not sure if you're there. Okay, Jonathan's maybe had to step away. Okay, but I guess any further comments regarding engagement with healthcare and clinical? Okay, well, in that case, thank you all very much indeed for your thoughts on that. That's been really, really useful and really interesting. I guess we then wanted to just, I guess, ask for if obviously we've kind of focused on those kind of three topic areas of integration and alignment to the standards, implementation, and clinical engagement. We also were interested, we didn't want to confine you to just giving us your thoughts on those topics. So very happy to hear from you in much broader terms about what you feel is working overall in GA4GH and what we could possibly do better. I think Angela has, the next slide also has a series of questions that are part of our survey. If you have comments that don't relate to these questions, we're delighted to hear those comments too. In fact, we would really, really value them because we're probably not going to hear them otherwise. But so any thoughts that anybody has overall about how GA4GH is doing, some of the questions though that we had also had was, how can we better support you or your organization's participation in the development of our technical standards and policy framing? What's the biggest hurdle preventing your team from participating more? How can J4GH better support you or your organization's participation? I think that's a repeat. Are the strategic priorities well suited to the current state of global genomics? Is J4GH's organizational structure well suited in terms of us having work streams and driver projects? So is that well suited to the needs of genomics? Does J4GH bring together the leading groups in the most relevant fields to advance genomic data sharing? What further alignment is needed? Are the work streams priorities and areas of focus decided upon with sufficient input from the driver project? So do you guys feel that you're being consulted enough? And are the work streams that you're involved in focused on the most important areas needed to share data and accelerate progress? And what technical standards and policy frameworks are missing from the J4GH strategic roadmap? That covers really a lot of stuff. I see Amreen has shared a link for you to share your thoughts on this one if you prefer to do it via the doc. Angela, I don't know if you want to also say anything about the process for sharing thoughts on this one.
Sure. I mean, I think that so far the process has been going really well. We're having this open discussion, but we also were thinking about providing access to this Jamboard so that you could actually just type in your own thoughts as this is a lot of questions and there's a lot of potential, directions that this could go. So I'll share the chat, I'll share the link in the chat. So if you want to participate in the Jamboard, you can go we have a slide for each of the questions, and then you can just go in and duplicate a slide here, and then you click on it and you can type in your thoughts and then save it, and it'll go and you can move it around. So if you want to participate that way, if you're more comfortable just sort of sharing your thoughts in writing, but we can also continue through this open verbal discussion, which has been going really well, Susan.
Okay. So I guess, first of all, does anybody have any general thoughts? Has anybody been kind of sitting feeling, I have this thing that I need to share with J4GH and we haven't asked about it yet? Okay, and I wonder, Catherine, I apologize because this is possibly picking on you a little bit, but you've talked a little bit about your experiences as a driver project, and I know that some of those questions that we were interested in relate to driver projects. I mean, do you feel that as a member of a driver project, do you feel like there's good consultation, and do you feel like you see your driver project's priorities being reflected in the way that the standards are going forward?
I'm trying to gather my thoughts. So I think that I think there has been good engagement. So my biggest involvement has been with the pedigree group, and they have been really good checking in with me, representing the Extra Africa project, in terms of how applicable it is for our driver project, and where there's a kind of entry point for us. One of the challenges has simply been that many of our Extra Africa projects, there are only a very few that actually collect family history and pedigree data, and they don't do it, most of them don't do it electronically either. So whilst we have been following this and we recognize the value of building a standard, I think the greatest help in that project has been that they've also been developing tools for capturing pedigree data using the standard. And so we're kind of at the point now where we're able to go back to our project and say the tool has finally been built based on the standard, which is almost near completion. And so now would you like to try it out? So I think that that's been handled really well in that project. And they've definitely been connecting with me and checking in, and I've been kind of going back to the few kind of research projects that collect that and checking with them, is this going to be useful for you, and how can you, they've given kind of use case scenarios for the team to work with, and so I think that has been going well. So I can only really speak from that project. I know that there's a number of other members within our HRA Bionet and HRA Africa that also work with Nikki, who've engaged in other projects. One of our team members worked in the dual ontology development, and that's also been picked up quite a lot in our driver project as a really useful ontology to implement in terms of consent use cases in our projects. So I think that for those projects that I've been involved in, my experience has been that there has been a good sense of checking in with the driver project on, how can you use this and how can it be used. I think it continues to be a major challenge for those of us attending meetings in the middle of the night. I know many members around the world have similar challenges. But what that has meant is that it's difficult to get members in our HRA Africa consortium who may not necessarily be directly involved with GA4GH to connect or to be able to join a meeting. And when they do, it's a kind of rare occasion, and they don't have a good sense of where things are, and find it difficult to engage because of that. So those super late night meetings, very difficult to encourage researchers in our consortium to come and join a meeting that's relevant to them. So what happens is we end up being the kind of spokesperson, not necessarily the one with the greatest skills to be able to engage directly with the standard being developed, but yeah, so that is continues to be a challenge.
I'm curious, Catherine, I mean, I'm not sure the extent to which we've succeeded in trying approaches other than the meetings for taking the work forward, either kind of, kind of the asynchronous methods of working, whether it's having conversations on GitHub repos or on mailing lists and trying to get input from people outside of the meetings. Is there anything that you've seen us do in your experience that has worked or helped to make the work accessible to people outside the meeting?
Definitely. So one of the things I was just writing on the survey when you picked on me was just to say that the meeting minutes and recordings are really excellent. They've been really transparent. They're often recorded, so you can catch up on meetings. So often, if I haven't been able to make a meeting, I can go back, check the minutes, catch up on what's happened. So although I may not have been able to contribute in that meeting, I'm able to kind of follow and keep up to date with the latest developments in the project. The projects have been using Slack a little bit. Often there are members, so they're the kind of team members often who are more technically minded, and they're busy on the kind of technical developments, and there vary some backwards and forwards between them on Slack. It might be nice if there was a kind of generally accessible Slack for members who may want to join from driver projects. So I mean, and I'm thinking about the ones like if I went to the projects who do the pedigree work, if I could say to them, would you like to be kind of, a receiver or a member on the Slack group about the latest developments, that might be helpful. But I think that the administrative side of kind of hosting the meetings and recording everything, and also making it so transparent, everybody's discussions and everything, I think it's fantastic. That's been managed really well. So I'd give a big thumbs up for that.
Okay, that's great. And also, I guess, curious as well, I mean, if you are watching a recording, say, and you have a comment, do you feel like you have a good avenue to share your thoughts on what was discussed on the meetings? And would that be Slack that you would primarily use for that, do you think?
I'm probably more likely to comment on the minutes document.
Okay.
I think that by the time I've caught up in a meeting, I don't always feel that maybe I've been involved and can contribute something or should step in retrospectively. But yeah, I haven't really thought about that. But I suppose I could pop a comment in the Slack channels. I hadn't really considered that. I just been saying the catch up.
Completely fine.
But I mean, the opportunity to do that just exists. We're able to add a comment in the minutes and message on Slack. So definitely communication channels are open.
Okay, that's good to hear. And I think especially encouraging for us, because I know that one of the anxieties that we have on Secretariat is that as Secretariat, do we do a good enough job in terms of getting around and staying in touch with the driver projects, which is perhaps a slightly different thing from driver projects having, directly staying in touch with the development work. But that's somewhat encouraging to hear. So thank you for that, Catherine.
Sure.
I guess, does anybody else have any comments or anything that they would like to add to Catherine's observations? I mean, Nikki, I wonder, do you have anything that you would like to add?
I think Catherine summed it up quite nicely. I think it's really easy to follow, when you have missed meetings and that. We still struggle with some meetings being late at night for us. But especially when you've been on meetings all day already. But I think, it's, as we've mentioned before, our challenges are more getting non-data related people interested in G4GH. But we're trying to be that liaison between the data people and or G4GH and the people who don't understand standards. But otherwise, I think, Catherine summed it up quite well. And I don't think I have anything else to add.
That's what.
Can I just ask a question? So we hear this obviously all the time. There's no one time that meetings can happen that would be appropriate for everyone. So we've tried a couple of things where we've, had like, you rotate monthly or you have the same meeting offered at different times. Is that helpful or is that not helpful because it disrupts the continuity of the conversation, sort of, takes it into two groups? Do you guys think as folks that can't join the current time, would you prefer an additional meeting time or to take things offline and do it asynchronously, like Susan was talking about Slack and other ways?
Yeah, I think if the conversation continues, you kind of feel like you're missing out, and then you feel the need, then you have to catch up. So as long as it's done such that it's not disjointed, and so the conversation then takes a different direction because there's a different bunch of people there. So I think when that happens, I don't really know if it's things that are going to be duplicated or those meetings are following on from the previous one, even though they're at a different time. So if that was maybe made a bit more clear and we knew that, okay, these topics were covered here and these topics were covered there, if you miss it, then, it'd be good to catch up rather than just say, well, it's okay, I missed it because we had a similar conversation somewhere else. So I think just making it clear as to what's going to happen in those different time slots. Obviously, it's much easier to plan if it's the same time slot every month, but if it's a same time slot that you can't make every month, then that's also just as bad. But maybe just as long as it's quite clear what's going to be discussed at each of those different meetings and whether it is important to catch up somehow with a recording or whether it's okay to have missed that because that conversation will be carried in your time zone meeting, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. So kind of clarity on the kind of continuity and the thread of the conversation, if it's continuing from one meeting to the next, even if they're at different time slots, and if there's a necessity to kind of catch up on material ahead of time. I wonder if anybody else has anything to say. I think Nia, Ucha, Mutya, I don't know if any of you have anything that you'd like to add. It's been great having you here for this conversation. And any thoughts that any of you would like to share?
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear? Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm not really actually a bioinformatician, but I just want to add that about some sort of a guidelines as like a sort of a crash course or some short guidelines on how to manage or how to interpret the genomic data for non-bioinformatician, I think. So it must be very, very helpful for others to understand. So it's just about inclusivity, I think. Yeah, that's all for me. Thank you.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to do a shameless plug for my host institute. I'm not sure if we have something that covers that, but I know that EMBL EBI has a set of training courses that are available online. I think
Yeah,
most
yeah.
of them are free, so I can't guarantee that there's something there, but I know that they host a number of aeration data resources, so there's a chance that there might be something there that might be of interest. Any thoughts from anybody else? Okay, well, I hope it goes without saying that we are really, really grateful for you having given us a substantial chunk of your time today. So thank you very much indeed for that. We're also very happy to hear from you at any other point in time, either via the user survey or if you want to drop us an email at Secretariat. If you suddenly have a brilliant idea for how we could be doing things better, we would love it if you would share it with us. But I think I am going to say again, thank you very much indeed. It's been really great, and thank you all for your participation in this. It really is incredibly valuable to us getting your thoughts on this stuff. So I think I'm going to draw this to a close. I know that the rest of the staff members on here would also like to share their thanks as well. And yes, again, thank you for your time. Really, really appreciate it.
Yes, this has been fabulous.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Take care.
Thanks for engaging with us.
Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks for coming.